So in our previous video, we talked about the processes by which water travels through plants. In this video, we're going to talk about how plants are adapted to control those processes. So essentially how plants adapt to different water conditions. So we can categorize plants based on the kinds of water environments they grow in. So first of all, mesophytes grow in mesic conditions, so relatively moist conditions. And most kind of cultivated plants that we see growing, like bananas and other crops, would fall into this category. Secondly, we have aquatics. So these are plants that are adapted to grow actually in water. So they might be emergent aquatics that grow out of the water and emerge out of the water. But they might also be completely submerged aquatics or floating aquatics that float on the surface of the water, like water lilies. Thirdly, we have hygrophytes. So these are plants that are adapted to grow in conditions that are very damp. So at least part of the year they might be inundated by water, but they're extremely damp soils, but not quite so much to the extent that we call them aquatics. Then we have xerophytes. They grow in xeric habitats, so extremely dry habitats. So these might be desert plants, or they might be epiphytes that grow on the surface of other plants, plants that have access to very little water. Lastly, we have halophytes. Halophytes are plants that are adapted to grow in extremely salty conditions. So that brings a kind of water stress. There might be abundant water, usually there is. These plants are adapted to grow on or near the coast. But the problem is, how do you use that water that obviously has a lot of salt dissolved in it without affecting the osmotic potential of your cells? So as plants adapt to their water environments, what they're really trying to do is to maximize their water use efficiency. And water use efficiency is the ratio of CO2 absorbed into the leaves for photosynthesis to the quantity of water that's lost to the atmosphere through transpiration. So plants want to maximize photosynthesis whilst minimizing water loss, particularly in hot, dry climates. So a point to ponder might be, in a hot, dry climate like a desert, what kinds of plants would have the highest water use efficiency and why? So I'm talking about a comparison between C3, C4 or CAM plants. And how might this relationship change in different climates? So I'm going to focus for the next few slides on some of the adaptations that plants have to survive in extremely dry climates. So in deserts where there's relatively little rainfall, in fact there might not be any rain for periods of several years, you get a lot of small herbaceous plants called desert annuals. So essentially these plants spend most of their time as dormant seeds that can survive long periods of drought. But when there is a period of rainfall, even if it's just a couple of weeks, these plants can quickly germinate, reach reproductive maturity, get pollinated and reproduce, and start to set seeds just in those couple of weeks that occur where water is available after a rainfall event. So really a plant that does this relies for most of its life cycle on the presence of water. So more than being able to survive drought, these are really drought avoidance strategies. So they spend the dry period as dormant seeds, but during the short periods where there is water available, that's when they'll go through the majority of their life cycle. So in tropical dry forests, you might not get drought periods as long as you'd find in the desert. But these are climates fairly similar to what we have here in South Florida. We have a wet season and then a long dry season where there might be relatively little rainfall for a period of 4 to 6 months. What some trees do in tropical dry forests is that they'll leaf during the wet season, and then when the dry season starts, they'll drop all of their leaves, but they'll flower during the beginning of this dry season. And we have a lot of plants that do this here in South Florida, where we have a climate that's something similar to a tropical dry forest. And one of them that you can see that's really beautiful flowers during the beginning of the dry season is this pink trumpet tree, Tabebuia rosea. So this is another drought avoidance strategy, and the obvious advantage is that by shedding their leaves, these plants will massively reduce the rate of water loss through transpiration. The trade-off, of course, is that by shedding their leaves, they no longer have any photosynthetic potential. So there's no way that they can build tissue and continue to generate resources during the dry period. So in addition to drought avoidance strategies, some plants can be adapted to actually tolerate long periods of drought. And these are the true xerophytes. Adaptations for dry conditions can come in the form of whole plant adaptations, or physiological adaptations, or morphological adaptations. And I'll start by describing some whole plant adaptations. For example, there might be differences in root structure and morphology that allow plants to be better adapted to dry climates. For example, in cacti, what we tend to see is these very shallow but broad-ranging root systems. And those root systems are adapted to take advantage of short, sharp rain showers that might occur in deserts. So they can absorb water that doesn't really percolate far down in the soil layer. The opposite strategy is what we see in phreatophytes. So phreatophytes are plants that have extremely deep roots that make it all the way down into the water table. So these plants might have access to water maybe all year round, despite occurring in extremely dry climates. There are also different morphological adaptations that root systems might have to make them well adapted to dry conditions. We see some very fibrous root systems like this one, and the idea of that is to have very thin net-like root systems that maximizes the surface area of the roots and makes them more able to absorb as much moisture as possible from the soil. The kind of opposite kind of system would be a taproot. So this is a very broad, deep root that taps deep into the soil, but obviously has a lower surface area. The other advantage of a taproot is that these roots can actually store resources in the roots. And maybe if there's a period of time during the year where the plant sheds its leaves and it can't photosynthesize, it can actually use stored resources in this kind of large taproot. So another kind of whole plant characteristic of drought-tolerant plants is exemplified by these succulents, these agave plants here. And these are succulent plants, which means they store a lot of water in vacuoles within their cells. Another feature of them is that they have a thick, waxy cuticle that surrounds their leaves, and this reduces the level of evaporation from the leaf tissue. Another way these plants reduce water loss through transpiration is by lowering their surface area to volume ratio. And that's particularly true of many cacti like this Opuntia species, in which actually the photosynthetic part of the plant is a stem, and the leaves have been reduced and adapted into spines. So they actually use their stems as the photosynthetic surface rather than leaves. So in addition to these whole plant adaptations, some plants are kind of physiologically adapted to tolerate dry conditions. And there are a couple of ways that plants can do this. Some plants are able to osmoregulate. So what that means is in really dry conditions, they can actually synthesize soluble compounds within their cells, which lowers the osmotic potential. So water is much more likely to flow into the cells through osmosis. A second physiological adaptation is something we see in what we call resurrection plants, and there's a really good example of this here on campus. It's the resurrection fern, Pleopeltis polypoidioides. These plants can actually synthesize proteins called dehydrins, which are very drought stable. What it means is that as the plants dry out, the cytoplasm within the cell just becomes kind of gelatinous. And the metabolic rate of the activity within the cell is reduced to almost zero. So the plants can just reduce their metabolic rate until such a time as we see more rainfall, when the cells can then rehydrate and metabolic rate starts to increase again. And these plants give a really good indication of whether maybe you even need to water your plants in the garden. If you see them looking very green and flush like this, you know that water availability is high, but a lot of the time they look almost unrecognizable, completely desiccated and brown like this. And it takes only a few hours for these plants to shift from this state to this state. In addition to whole plant and physiological adaptations, we may also see morphological adaptations to drought. And these are mainly adaptations of the leaves. So one example is sclerophyll. Sclerophyll or sclerophilic plants are plants that have very tough leathery leaves, so it just reduces water loss through that kind of thick, waxy or leathery cuticle. Another adaptation is known as amphistomy, and this is where we see stomata on both sides of the leaf. So you might wonder, why is that an adaptation to drought? Well, really, it's not so much an adaptation to the dry conditions, but an adaptation that allows these plants to photosynthesize maximally when there is water and when they are able to open their stomata. So similarly, another adaptation that many drought-tolerant plants have is isobilateral leaves. And these are leaves that have palisade mesophyll on both the upper and the lower surface. And essentially it means they have more kind of highly photosynthetic surface on the leaf. And often these plants will hold their leaves upright so that they have maximum exposure to sun. So this plant on the right-hand side, you can see is a plant with isobilateral leaves, and it holds most of its leaves directly upright so that both surfaces receive direct sunlight. Another morphological adaptation that leaves might have to dry conditions is stomatal crypts. And what that means is essentially where the stomata of the leaf are kind of sunken down, and there's kind of a little crypt or a little cave in the leaf before the stomata. What that does is it kind of traps moist air in this crypt, and it lowers the kind of vapor potential between the intercellular space and the atmosphere, reducing the rate of transpiration. So we saw this table from your textbook in the previous video, and it shows how plants adapted to different climatic conditions vary the density, so the number, and the size of their stomata. And so it just highlights that another adaptation that plants can have to dry conditions is just altering the number and size of stomata on each leaf. So we focus most of our attention on xerophytes, plants that are adapted to live in very dry conditions. But what about hygrophytes? What about adaptations to live in very wet environments? Well, one of the big adaptations that plants need is, not surprisingly, in the roots. So root tissue of plants usually needs some access to oxygen in order to fuel the process of cellular respiration. But in very kind of inundated wet environments like these, the soil conditions become very anoxic and there's no access to oxygen. And so one of the ways that plants adapt to that is through root tissues called erenchyma. And these are root tissues that reach up into the atmosphere and give some connectivity between the rest of the root system and air in the atmosphere. This gives the plants, the root tissues, access to some oxygen for cellular respiration. And that erenchyma can take different forms. This is a red mangrove up here, and it has these aerial prop roots. And also this is a black mangrove here with these tiny finger-like projections called pneumatophores. These are cypress trees that you might find in a cypress dome habitat in the Everglades here in South Florida, and they provide another example of erenchyma root tissue in the form of these cypress knees. So these cypress knees are root tissue that's adapted to provide connectivity between the roots in the anoxic environment of the inundated soil and the atmosphere, where they can find some oxygen to fuel cellular respiration.